The gavel slammed down with the finality of thunder, and Deputy Shane Colton's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Ivy Marlowe step onto the auction block. Her emerald eyes swept the crowd of leering men with defiance that made his chest tighten, even as iron shackles bound her delicate wrists. The autumn of 1847 had brought drought to Millbrook Valley, and with it, desperate measures that turned human souls into currency. "Starting bid for this fine specimen is $50, bellowed Silas Grimwold, the town's most ruthless creditor, his yellowed teeth gleaming in the lantern light. "She's strong-backed and bred for work. Look at those hands, not a soft bone." Shane's fingers tightened around his deputy's badge, the metal cutting into his palm. 3 months ago, Ivy's father had borrowed heavily against his failing farm, using his daughter's freedom as collateral, a practice that skirted the edges of legality in their remote Colorado settlement. When Cornelius Marlowe died of fever last week, his debts became Ivy's burden, and Grimwold had wasted no time claiming his prize, $60. Called out Jeremiah Voss, a cattle rancher whose wives had a tendency to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Ivy's chin lifted higher, and Shane caught the flash of tears she refused to shed. He'd loved her since they were children splashing in Willow Creek, but his modest deputy salary of $15 a month made him invisible to her father, who'd sought a wealthy son-in-law to save the family farm. "$75. shouted Marcus Blackthorne, whose scarred hands spoke of violence both casual and calculated. Shane's mind raced. His life savings amounted to barely $40, hardly enough to compete with the wealthy vultures circling their prey. But watching Ivy's shoulders square with desperate courage, he knew he'd trade his badge, his reputation, and his future for one chance to save her. The crowd pressed closer, their breath fogging in the crisp air as October's bite sharpened the night. Shane pushed through the mass of bodies, his heart pounding so loud he was certain everyone could hear it over Grimwold's continued auctioneering. "Do I hear 80? This beautiful specimen won't last long in lesser hands, gentlemen. She needs a firm master to break that spirit properly." At those words, something primal and protective exploded in Shane's chest. He'd seen what men like Voss and Blackthorne did to women who couldn't fight back, how they used their wealth as weapons and their isolation as shields. The thought of Ivy suffering such a fate made his vision blur with rage. $100. The words tore from his throat before rational thought could stop them. Every head turned toward him, including Ivy's, whose eyes widened with shock and something that might have been hope. Grimwold's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. Well, Deputy Colton, I didn't know law enforcement paid so handsomely. Do you have such funds?" Shane's mouth went dry as desert sand. He didn't have $100. He didn't have 50. But as he stared into Ivy's green eyes, seeing both gratitude and terror warring there, he knew exactly what he was going to do. "I'll have it before sunrise," he declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "Hold the auction until dawn." The saloon doors burst open as Shane stumbled into the smoky interior, his mind reeling with the magnitude of his promise. Dawn was 6 hours away, and he needed to conjure money he didn't possess to save the woman he'd loved in secret for years. The amber liquid in the glasses seemed to mock him as he surveyed the room full of card players and drifters. "Colton!" Buck Henley's gravelly voice cut through the haze. The grizzled prospector waved him over to a corner table where serious money changed hands nightly. "Heard you made quite the spectacle at Grimwold's circus. You got that kind of cash lying around?" Shane slumped into the vacant chair, noting the pile of gold coins glinting in the lamplight. "Not yet, but I will." Buck's weathered face cracked into a grin. "Only one way a man raises that much money in one night around here, boy. You ready to risk everything on the turn of a card?" The other players, Jasper Crenshaw, a traveling gambler in a wine-colored vest, and Two-Shot Murphy, whose nickname came from his preferred method of debt collection, studied Shane with predatory interest. These men had bankrupted ranchers and destroyed families over games that lasted until sunrise. "What's your stake?" Jasper asked, shuffling a worn deck with practiced elegance. "You can't buy into this game with good intentions and a deputy's salary." Shane's hand moved to the badge on his chest. The 5-pointed star had been his father's before consumption claimed him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Colton men had worn it with honor, upholding justice in a land where law often came from the barrel of a gun. "This badge represents a permanent position," Shane said slowly. "Sheriff Hawkins is near retirement. The town council's been grooming me to take over. That's worth something." Two-Shot leaned forward, his scarred knuckles cracking. "You're talking about betting your entire future, boy. Your career, your reputation, your place in this community. All for some farmer's daughter who wouldn't give you a second glance when her daddy was alive." The words stung because they held truth. Ivy had been polite but distant during her father's desperate attempts to marry her to wealth. She'd saved her smiles for the banker's son and the merchant's heir, never seeming to notice the deputy who watched her from across the church pews every Sunday. "She's not some farmer's daughter," Shane said quietly. "She's everything good left in this world, and I won't let animals like Voss get their hands on her." Buck nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of conviction that wins poker games, son. But conviction don't make up for bad cards." As if summoned by their conversation, the saloon doors swung open again, and Ivy herself stepped inside. Gasps and mutters rippled through the room. Respectable women didn't enter such establishments, especially not at midnight. But desperation had stripped away pretense, and Shane could see the wild determination in her eyes. "Shane Colton," she called across the room, ignoring the leers and whispered comments. "I need to speak with you." He rose from the table, his legs unsteady. "Ivy, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." She crossed the distance between them with swift, purposeful strides, her dark hair escaping its pins after the evening's ordeal. Up close, he could see the red marks the shackles had left on her wrists, and his rage flared anew. "I heard what you did," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Why would you risk so much for me? We barely know each other." The question pierced him like a blade. How could he explain years of silent devotion, of watching her laugh with other men, while he memorized every expression that crossed her face? How could he tell her that her happiness had become more important to him than his own breathing? "Because someone has to stand up to men like Grimwald," he said instead. "This auction, what they're doing to you, it's wrong." Her green eyes searched his face, and for a moment, Shane thought he saw something deeper than gratitude flickering there. "There's more to it than justice," Ivy said, stepping closer until Shane could smell the lavender soap she'd used that morning before her world collapsed into chaos. "I see the way you look at me during church services. The way you always happen to be patrolling past our farm when I'm hanging laundry." Heat flooded Shane's face. He'd thought himself invisible in his devotion, but apparently love was harder to hide than he'd imagined. "Ivy, I know you don't have the money you promised," she continued, her voice soft but urgent. "But I might know where we can get it." Before Shane could respond, she pressed a folded paper into his palm. Her fingers lingered against his skin for a heartbeat longer than necessary, sending electricity up his arm. "My father wasn't just a farmer," she whispered. "He was also a cartographer for the Territorial Survey. Before he died, he told me about a cache gold coins hidden by Spanish explorers 2 centuries ago. He drew a map." Shane unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Detailed sketches showed landmarks he recognized: Devil's Tooth Rock, the Twisted Oak by Miller's Creek, the old mine shaft where children dared each other to venture. X marked a spot near the abandoned silver mine, barely 3 hours' ride from town. Ivy, treasure maps are the stuff of fairy tales. Your father was delirious with fever. He was lucid when he gave me this, she interrupted fiercely. He said the Spanish buried it during an Apache raid, intending to return. They never did. Shane, this could be real. The poker players at Buck's table were growing impatient, their voices rising in discussion of other potential games. Dawn crept closer with each passing minute, and Shane felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Even if this is real, he said, we'd need horses, supplies, time. And it's dangerous country after dark mountain lions, unstable ground near the mines. Ivy's jaw set with stubborn determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. I'd rather die free in those mountains than live as Voss's property. Shane, you risked everything for me tonight. Let me risk something for both of us. The saloon's crude laughter suddenly felt distant as Shane studied the woman before him. Moonlight streaming through dirty windows caught the copper highlights in her hair, and he realized that somewhere between the auction block and this moment, she'd stopped being a distant dream and become a partner in the most dangerous gamble of his life. The horses, he said. Already arranged. Ivy's eyes gleamed with newfound purpose. Martha Hendricks owes my family a debt of kindness. Her husband's horses are the fastest in 3 counties. She have them ready within the hour. Shane looked back at the poker table, then at the badge weighing heavy on his chest. The safe path would be to bet his future on cards and luck, accepting whatever fate the morning brought. The reckless path led into darkness toward a treasure that might not exist, with a woman who'd suddenly become more real to him than anything else in the world. If we're caught, it'll look like we're fleeing together, he said slowly. Your reputation will be ruined either way. Ivy's smile held no fear, only fierce hope. But if we succeed, I'll be free to choose my own path. And maybe. She didn't finish the sentence, but Shane heard the unspoken possibilities in her voice. For the first time since the auction began, he felt something other than desperation. He felt alive. The horses' hooves drummed against the frozen ground as Shane and Ivy rode hard through the Colorado night, their breath forming silver clouds in the mountain air. Martha Hendricks had provided not only the finest mounts in the territory, but also supplies, rope, lanterns, and a shotgun that Shane prayed they wouldn't need. There, Ivy called over the wind, pointing toward a jagged silhouette against the star-scattered sky. Devil's Tooth Rock, we're close. Shane pulled up beside her, marveling at how naturally she sat her horse despite the expensive riding dress that had once marked her as a gentleman's daughter. Tonight, with her hair streaming loose and her eyes bright with purpose, she looked like something wild and magnificent, a frontier goddess, racing toward destiny. The map led them down a narrow ravine where ancient pines twisted into grotesque shapes. Shane kept his hand near his pistol, knowing that gold wasn't the only treasure men killed for in these mountains. Ivy's beauty alone would be enough to drive desperate men to violence. The twisted oak should be just ahead, Ivy said, consulting the map by moonlight. Then 200 paces toward the old mine. They found the oak easily, a massive tree whose trunk had been split by lightning decades ago, leaving it growing in 2 directions like a lover's arms reaching for an embrace. Shane helped Ivy down from her horse, and their hands lingered together longer than necessary. Shane, she said quietly, if we don't find anything ... we'll find another way, he promised, though doubt gnawed at his certainty. Dawn was 3 hours away, and even if they discovered gold, they'd need time to return to town and raise the money for her freedom. They followed the map's directions toward the mine, counting paces and checking landmarks. The abandoned shaft. loomed ahead like a mouth opening into the earth's secrets. Shane had played here as a boy, never imagining he'd return as a man gambling everything on buried Spanish gold. 20 paces north of the mine entrance, Ivy read from the map. Look for 3 stones arranged in a triangle. They found the markers easily, 3 rocks that seemed naturally placed but formed too perfect a triangle to be coincidence. Shane began digging with the small shovel Martha had provided, his muscles straining against the hard-packed earth. "Let me help," Ivy said, kneeling beside him. Her shoulder brushed against his as they worked together, and Shane felt the warmth of her body through the layers of fabric that separated them. "Ivy," he said, pausing in his digging, "why didn't you ever notice me before? All those years I was right there." She stopped digging and looked at him directly, her green eyes reflecting starlight. "Because I was looking in all the wrong directions. My father taught me that security came from marrying well, from finding a man with money and position. But tonight, watching you risk everything for me." She touched his cheek with earth-stained fingers. "I realized I'd been confusing security with love." Before Shane could respond, his shovel struck something solid with a metallic ring that echoed in the night air. They looked at each other with wild hope, then began digging frantically around the obstruction. A small chest emerged from the earth, its iron bindings green with age but still intact. Shane's hand shook as he lifted it free, feeling the weight of metal shifting inside. They looked at each other for a long moment, hardly daring to believe their fortune. "Open it," Ivy whispered. Shane broke the rusted lock with his knife, and they lifted the lid together. Moonlight struck gold, not just coins, but an entire fortune in Spanish pieces of 8 and gold ingots that must have been worth thousands of dollars. "My God," Shane breathed, "your father was right." Ivy laughed with pure joy, the sound echoing off the mountain walls. "We did it, Shane. We actually did it." Without thinking, Shane pulled her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. When he set her down, their faces were inches apart, and the laughter died away as something deeper passed between them. "Ivy," he said softly, and then she was kissing him. Fierce and desperate and full of promises neither of them had dared speak aloud. The kiss lasted only moments, but it changed everything between them. When they broke apart, Shane saw his own wonder reflected in Ivy's eyes, the recognition that what had begun as a desperate rescue had transformed into something neither of them had expected to find. "We need to get back," Ivy said breathlessly, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. "Dawn's coming, and Grimwold will be waiting." They loaded the treasure into their saddlebags, the weight of gold making the horses snort with effort. As they prepared to mount, Shane caught Ivy's hand in his. "After this is over," he said, "after you're free, what then?" "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I get to choose my own path. It's terrifying and wonderful." "Choose me," Shane said simply. "Choose us. I know I'm not wealthy like the men your father wanted you to marry, but I love you, Ivy. I've loved you for years." She smiled, and Shane thought the expression was more beautiful than all the Spanish gold they'd just discovered. "You risked everything for me tonight. Your badge, your future, your reputation. What more could any woman ask for in a man?" They rode back toward Millbrook Valley as the eastern sky began to lighten, their horses' hooves carrying them toward a dawn that would determine their fate. Shane's mind raced with plans. They'd need to convert some of the gold quickly, quietly, without raising too many questions about its source. "Buck Henley," Shane said suddenly. "He'll buy gold without asking too many questions, and he's got connections throughout the territory. If we can get to him before the auction resumes, and if someone's watching, if Grimwold has men positioned to make sure you can't interfere," Shane's jaw tightened, "then we'll have to be smarter than them." As they approached the town's outskirts, They could see lantern light glowing in windows. The entire settlement was awake, buzzing with gossip about the night's events. Word of Shane's dramatic bid and Ivy's mysterious disappearance had spread like wildfire. They separated a mile from town, agreeing that Ivy would return to her father's farmhouse while Shane sought out Buck to exchange gold for currency. The parting felt dangerous, as if their newfound connection might dissolve with distance. "If something goes wrong," Ivy said, "if they arrest you or if Grimold refuses to honor the auction." "Nothing's going wrong," Shane said firmly. "I'm getting you out of this, and then we're starting fresh. Together." Buck was waiting in his cabin as if he'd expected Shane's return. The old prospector's eyes widened when Shane showed him the Spanish gold, but he asked no questions as they negotiated a fair exchange rate. "This is enough to buy the girl 3 times over," Buck observed, counting out American currency. "What's your plan for the remainder?" "New start somewhere," Shane said. "Maybe California, maybe Oregon territory. Somewhere we can build something together." As the sun crested the mountains, Shane walked toward the town square where Grimold waited. With growing impatience, a crowd had gathered again, drawn by the drama of the previous night and the promise of its resolution. "Deputy Colton," Grimold called as Shane approached, "I trust you have the funds you so boldly promised?" Shane pulled out the leather pouch, containing exactly $100 in gold coins and currency. "Right here, as promised." But as Grimold reached for the money, Sheriff Hawkins stepped from the crowd, his weathered face grim with authority and disappointment. "Shane," Sheriff said quietly, "I need to speak with you, now." Sheriff Hawkins led Shane away from the crowd, his face etched with the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. They stopped beside the jail, where morning shadows still clung to the building's weathered walls. "Son, where did you get that money?" Hawkins asked, his voice heavy with paternal concern. "Your salary is $15 a month. You don't have family wealth. Last night you were desperate enough to bet your badge at a poker table, and this morning you're carrying more gold than most men see in a lifetime." Shane's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd anticipated questions from Grimold or the townspeople, but not from the man who'd been like a father to him since his parents died. The weight of lies felt heavier than the Spanish treasure had been. "Sheriff, there've been reports, Shane. Travelers on the mountain roads, miners working late shifts. They're saying someone was digging near the old Spanish mine last night, same time you and Miss Marlowe disappeared from town." The accusation hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Shane realized that in a territory where news traveled faster than horses, their nocturnal treasure hunt hadn't gone as unnoticed as they'd hoped. "Are you asking me as my boss or as a lawman?" Shane said carefully. "Both." Hawkins crossed his arms, his badge catching the morning light. "That mine's on federal land, Shane. Anything found there belongs to the territorial government. If you've been mining without permits, or if you've disturbed archaeological sites, and if I told you Miss Marlowe had a map left by her father, that we found a cache buried by Spanish explorers centuries ago?" Hawkins' expression didn't change. "I'd say that's a convenient story that might hold up in court. Might not. But more importantly, I'd say you've compromised your integrity as a peace officer. You can't uphold laws while breaking them, son." From the town square, they could hear Grimold's voice rising in impatience. The auction crowd was growing restless, and Shane knew that every passing minute increased the danger that someone else might outbid him for Ivy's freedom. "Sheriff," Shane said desperately, "what they're doing to her is wrong. Selling a human being like livestock. The law's the law. Shane, debt bondage is legal in this territory, however distasteful we might find it. But treasure hunting on federal land without permits isn't." Shane felt the walls of his carefully constructed plan crumbling around him. All the gold in the world wouldn't matter if he ended up in prison for theft from federal property. Worse, if he was arrested, there'd be no one to save Ivy from whatever fate Grimwald had planned. "What do you want me to do?" Shane asked finally. Before Hawkins could answer, rapid hoofbeats echoed through the street. They turned to see Ivy riding hard toward them, her face flushed with urgency and fear. She pulled up beside them, breathing hard. "Shane," she gasped, "Voss and 3 of his men just rode out to my father's farm. Martha Hendricks sent word there, searching for evidence that we were together last night. If they find the rest of the gold—" The implication struck Shane like a physical blow. If Voss discovered the treasure, he'd claim it as compensation for his lost bid on Ivy. Worse, he'd have evidence that Shane and Ivy had been operating outside the law. "Sheriff," Ivy said, turning to Hawkins with desperate dignity, "I know what this looks like. I know the law seems to be against us. But sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." Hawkins studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Miss Marlowe, are you asking me to look the other way while my deputy breaks federal regulations?" "I'm asking you to remember why you became a lawman in the first place," she replied. "Was it to enforce every statute regardless of its moral implications, or was it to protect people who can't protect themselves?" The sheriff's hand moved to his own badge, fingers tracing its familiar weight. Shane held his breath, knowing that the next few moments would determine not just Ivy's fate, but the future of everything he'd worked to build in Millbrook Valley. From the town square, Grimwald's voice carried clearly on the morning air. "If Deputy Colton doesn't appear in 5 minutes with the promised funds, I'll resume the auction. And this time, there'll be no delays." Sheriff Hawkins looked between Shane and Ivy for what felt like an eternity, his hand still resting on his badge. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mountain mist and illuminating the crossroads where law, justice, and love converged in impossible contradiction. "You know what, son?" Hawkins said finally, a slow smile creeping across his weathered features. "I've been enforcing the law in this territory for 23 years. I've seen good people destroyed by bad laws and evil men protected by legal technicalities. Maybe it's time I remembered the difference between being a peace officer and being a servant of justice." He turned toward the town square, his boots striking the wooden sidewalk with renewed purpose. "Let's go buy Miss Marlowe's freedom before Grimwald sells her to the highest bidder. As for the source of your funds, ... double quotes, he winked at Shane. Sometimes a sheriff's eyesight isn't what it used to be. The crowd parted as the 3 of them approached the auction block. Grimwald stood with his pocket watch open, his face flushed. With self-important authority, Voss sat his horse nearby, his scarred hands gripping the reins with obvious frustration. "Deputy Colton," Grimwald called, snapping his watch closed. "You're cutting it close. Do you have the $100 you promised?" "Right here," Shane said, producing the leather pouch. The gold coins clinked as he handed them over, each sound like a bell tolling for Ivy's freedom. Grimwald examined the money carefully, biting several coins to test their authenticity. His face soured as he realized he could find no fault with the payment. "Very well," he said reluctantly. "Miss Marlowe's debt is satisfied. She's free to go." But as Grimwald pocketed the coins, Voss urged his horse forward, his face twisted with rage. "Not so fast. I have reason to believe this money was obtained through illegal means. Sheriff, I demand you investigate the source of these funds." Hawkins stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Voss, are you questioning the integrity of my deputy? I'm saying he didn't have this kind of money yesterday, and suddenly he's got more gold than most ranchers see in a year. Something's not right." The crowd murmured agreement, and Shane felt the precarious balance of their victory beginning to shift. But then Ivy stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Mr. Voss is correct, she announced. Deputy Colton didn't have this money yesterday. The crowd's murmur grew louder, but Ivy continued. Because yesterday, I hadn't told him about my father's final gift to me. She produced a folded document from her coat, not the treasure map, but something else Shane didn't recognize. My father was more than a failed farmer. He was also a surveyor for the territorial government, and he discovered something valuable on our land years ago. Something he documented legally before his death. Ivy handed the document to Sheriff Hawkins, who examined it with growing surprise. This is a territorial survey claim, properly filed and recorded. It grants mineral rights to the Marlowe property, including, Ivy said with quiet triumph, a small vein of placer gold that my father chose never to work, hoping to leave it as my inheritance. Deputy Colton and I spent the night extracting enough gold to pay my debts. Every ounce legally mine to give. The crowd's mood shifted again, this time toward admiration for Ivy's cleverness and Shane's determination. Even Voss seemed deflated by the revelation that their midnight expedition had been perfectly legal. Grimwold pocketed the coins with obvious reluctance. The debt is satisfied, he repeated. Miss Marlowe is free. As the crowd began to disperse, Shane felt Ivy slip her hand into his. The simple touch sent electricity through him, a promise of all the mornings they might wake up together, all the challenges they might face as partners. What now? He asked quietly. Now we decide what to do with the rest of our treasure, she said, smiling. And whether a certain deputy wants to keep his badge or try his hand at gold mining with a partner. Shane looked at the badge on his chest, then at Sheriff Hawkins, who was watching them with paternal pride. I think, Shane said slowly, that Millbrook Valley needs a sheriff who understands the difference between law and justice. And his wife needs to know that her husband will always fight for what's right, even when it's not easy. Ivy's eyes widened. Shane Colton, are you proposing to me? I'm proposing that we build something together, he said. A life, a future, maybe even a family. What do you say, Miss Marlowe? Her kiss was his answer, sweet and fierce and full of promises that would carry them through whatever adventures lay ahead. As the Colorado sun climbed toward noon, Shane Colton realized he'd gained far more than gold in the mountains. He'd found his home in the heart of the woman who'd chosen to love him back. In the distance, church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to worship and celebration. Shane and Ivy walked hand in hand toward their future, leaving behind the auction block and embracing a love that had been worth every risk they'd taken to claim it.